Well, the World Economic Forum describes itself as being the premier promoter of public partnerships globally. So I guess the question to really understand what the WEF is what is a public-private partnership, at least as imagined by the World Economic Forum? So essentially, public-private partnerships put private entities, multinational corporations, and things of the like on equal footing with the public sector. But when you consider that most quote-unquote democracies around the world have their politicians bought and essentially owned by those same multinational corporations, it's really more of a private partnership. And what you're having there is essentially a means of implementing specific policies being controlled more often than not by the corporate sector, and by promoting this, what is essentially a fusion of the private and public sector. What is essentially being enacted here, it has historically been defined as corporatism, which, if people remember back, Benito Mussolini, for example, defined his particular brand of fascism in the early and mid 20th century as corporatism, a merging of private and public power. Looking at it through that frame of reference, essentially the World Economic Forum, more or not globally, is promoting a fascistic ideology around the world. They have a habit of creating policies through both the public-private partnerships that are housed within the World Economic Forum and affiliated with but external to the World Economic Forum. Those policies are given then to governments around the world, and many governments around the world have a lot of prominent officials who in the past have been trained by the quote-unquote leadership programs of the World Economic Forum and its affiliates. And of course, the World Economic Forum's most well-known leadership training program is currently called Young Global Leaders. It previously had a couple different iterations. It's rather closely affiliated with the Harvard Kennedy School, specifically the Center for Public Leadership, which is majority funded by Jeffrey Epstein's most well-known benefactor, Leslie Wexner, who throughout his decades of quote-unquote philanthropy has been focused on developing leaders around the world, specifically in the Israeli government. And as I've noted in my work, Leslie Wexner and Epstein had pretty significant ties to Israeli intelligence. So in addition to that, the World Economic Forum, in addition to this of promoting public-private partnership and setting policy, is also a major promoter of what's called the Fourth Industrial Revolution, which we can talk about a little bit later. But essentially, the Fourth Industrial Revolution is defined by the founder and chairman of the World Economic Forum, Klaus Schwab, refers to a merging of our biological and digital selves, essentially a merging of man and machine to create symbiosis. And this ideology is more often than not referred to as transhumanism. So the World Economic Forum, another thing that's important to know about it is who is essentially in charge. So, of course, it was co-founded and is nominally run by Klaus Schwab, whose background I can talk about shortly, but it's also important to point out who is on the board of trustees of the WEF. So you have very prominent people. For example, the head of the IMF is there, former Vice President Al Gore is there, Larry Fink of BlackRock is there. The head of Salesforce, a major Silicon Valley company, Mark Benioff, is there and very much affiliated with the Fourth Industrial Revolution policies of the WEF. You have the chief executive officer of Nestle, one of the co-founders of the Carlyle Group, which has extensive intelligence connections. In other various big tech companies, governments, and essentially a major representation of the multinational corporate world. And so these are the people that are essentially driving this public partnership model around the world, and they have very specific policy agendas that, again, the WEF drafts policy papers and white papers, and these are sent and then implemented by governments around the world. In 2019, the World Economic Forum entered into a strategic alliance with the United Nations with the idea of having the United Nations essentially use public-private partnerships as the model for nearly all policies that it implements, most specifically the implementation of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, sometimes referred to as Agenda 2030. And a lot of these policies, again, have been developed not by, the public sectors of the world at the United Nations, but the World Economic Forum and its affiliates. So that being said, it's worth pointing out that in the late 90s, at the World Economic Forum annual meeting, the then head of the UN, Kofi Annan, essentially said that the World Economic Forum had been in part responsible for what he referred to as a quiet or silent revolution at the UN, where the UN, instead of championing the public sectors of the world, which is how most people think of the UN, they would instead begin to prioritize the needs of the businesses of the world, so multinational corporations and whatnot. So over the past several decades, with the World Economic Forum being a major part of this, the United Nations has been pushed to essentially prioritize corporate needs over public needs. And this again shows quite clearly the corrupting influence of public-private partnerships and their effects on our society. So who is Klaus Schwab exactly? So, I haven't personally investigated Klaus Schwab, but a contributor to Unlimited Hangout, my website, named Johnny Vedmore, also an investigative journalist, dug very deeply into Klaus Schwab and his family history and his early history and the early history of the World Economic Forum itself. So what's important to know here is that Klaus Schwab's father was a man named Eugene Schwab. During World War II, Eugene Schwab was running the Ravensburg branch of a company called Escher Weiss, which was, among other things, producing different aspects or different components needed by the Nazi war machine, and perhaps most critically, aspects of the Nazi atomic bomb program. So right before Klaus Schwab became involved with the company his father was affiliated with and was, affiliated with the apartheid regime in South Africa and their nuclear ambitions, Klaus Schwab had attended an international seminar at Harvard University where his mentor, he was introduced to his mentor, Henry Kissinger. And that particular seminar that Schwab attended, Kissinger's international seminar at Harvard, was later revealed to have been heavily funded by the Central Intelligence Agency. So it's very relevant that Klaus Schwab was essentially recruited by Kissinger at an intelligence-linked seminar at Harvard, which has, again, historical links with the American oligarchy and the intelligence apparatus. So after that point, in the early 70s, Klaus Schwab creates the World Economic Forum. He does this, again, with people somewhat in the Kissinger network. People like John Kenneth Galbraith and Herman Kahn, who later becomes a prominent figure at the Hudson Institute, a pretty well-known think tank in D.C. that's rather hawkish. And so what's odd about that is that John Kenneth Galbraith, Kahn, and also Kissinger were considered among the preeminent experts at this period of time of thermonuclear war and its consequences. And, that's rather interesting when you consider the affiliation of Schwab and his father with some of these atomic bomb programs historically. And then beyond that, some of the earliest affiliations with the World Economic Forum were with members of an organization called the Club of Rome, which historically has been affiliated with neo-Malthusianism and the idea of population control, which of course intersects very much with Henry Kissinger himself. People that are familiar with Kissinger's history will know that while he was a Secretary of State, he was responsible for creating what is colloquially remembered as the Kissinger Report, but was essentially describing how population growth in the global South was a threat to U.S. national security and called for efforts to be made, both overt and covert, to reduce the size of populations in the global South. So the Club of Rome and its neo-Malthusian connections are relevant in that sense, given the overlap with Klaus Schwab and the World Economic Forum with both of those worlds and those similar rather eugenicist policies. So essentially, the Club of Rome and its flagship paper, The Limits of Growth, were a subject of intense focus at the earliest World Economic Forum meetings. Of course, at that point, the World Economic Forum was not called as such. It was originally founded as the European Management Symposium and subsequently became the World Economic Forum. So there's a couple different definitions of transhumanism, but I think the most important is from its earliest uses, because you can see essentially the ideologies that it came out of. So at the close of World War II, a man named Julian Huxley was appointed Director General of UNESCO, the social and cultural body of the United Nations. Julian Huxley may be best known as the brother of the science fiction writer of, Brave New World, among other titles, Aldous Huxley. But Julian Huxley was actually the president of the British Eugenics Society for an extended period of time, and an ardent supporter of the eugenics ideology. And this is reflected in one of the first documents he wrote in his position at UNESCO, charting his vision for the UN agency, where he essentially said, and I'm paraphrasing, but he said, we need to make the unthinkable thinkable again with regards to eugenics, which is quite a startling statement to make, so close to the conclusion of the Second World War. Roughly a decade later, Julian Huxley writes a book called New Bottles for New Wine, and within that book coins the term transhumanism, where he essentially states that the eugenics ideal of yesteryear has evolved as a consequence of advances and projected advances in technology, and that the new eugenics is the merging of man and machine, gene editing in vivo, and some of these other brave new technologies, right? So essentially transhumanism ever since then has picked up steam. A lot of its supporters are people that historically have had ties to the eugenics movement. For example, the Rockefeller Foundation is a really good example of that. And again, you have the association of the World Economic Forum and Klaus Schwab from the 70s on with the neo-Malthusian outlet, the Club of Rome. And Schwab, of course, is one of the biggest promoters globally of what he refers to, and I think he actually coined the term, the Fourth Industrial Revolution, which is essentially about human-machine symbiosis and what this means for industry. And, Klaus Schwab hasn't necessarily said this himself, but people that are prominently featured at World Economic Forum annual meetings, for example, Israeli historian Yuval Noah Harari, have made the point that the Fourth Industrial Revolution is different from past industrial revolutions because you essentially, for example, in the Industrial Revolution and in the late 19th century, this was, you essentially had two classes. You had the exploited and the unexploited. And he says, in contrast now, the Fourth Industrial Revolution will mean that the classes instead will be the unexploited, the exploited, and the irrelevant. And he argues that it's much better to be exploited than irrelevant. And then, of course, in this scenario, the unexploited would be the oligarchs of society. And he's essentially admitting that the Fourth Industrial Revolution is essentially a recipe for neo-feudalism, but one that's managed by extremely invasive and advanced technology. Other things that Klaus Schwab has said about the Fourth Industrial Revolution, the way he defines it is that it's a merging of our physical and biological selves. So a lot of this involves technology that is either worn on the body, such as wearables, or things implanted in the body, such as these brain chips that are being manufactured by various companies, but the most well-known is probably Elon Musk's Neuralink. And a lot of this technology, specifically the brain-machine interfaces, are promoted as, helping the blind see again and people that are paralyzed be able to walk again. And it may restore functionality in those cases, but it's quite clear from Neuralink, the World Economic Forum, and other groups that are supportive of this technology that the idea is to have it be widely commercialized and essentially become what the smartphone is for society today, have it become normalized and used rather extensively. And what's concerning about this is, again, I'm going to refer back to statements made by Yuval Noah Harari at World Economic Forum meetings. He essentially says the point that technology gets into your body and is capable of surveilling your thoughts is the line that the world crosses into what he refers to as a digital dictatorship, where the leadership will be able to know what you really think about them and what you really think about issues. And if you don't agree, to use his words, you'll end up in the gulag the next morning, even if you externally are acting like you're supportive of the state line and things like this. So, this is a recipe for disasters, particularly in the wrong hands. And in Harari's speeches at the World Economic Forum, he's imploring the people at that meeting, which is, the essentially a meeting of the oligarchies of around the world, to take this technology in their hands and use it for their benefit, not necessarily the public's benefit. So this is definitely something that should be watched very closely. So one of the public-private partnerships housed within the World Economic Forum is called the Partnership Against Cybercrime. Essentially what you have here is a meeting of intelligence-linked tech companies, some tech companies not necessarily directly linked to intelligence, some of the biggest banks in the world, a lot of financial institutions, the US Department of Justice, the FBI, the UK's National Crime Agency, and Israel National Cyber Directorate. This particular partnership is led by a man named Toil Goldstein, who was one of the World Economic Forum's head of strategy, particularly on everything related to cybersecurity. This is relevant because Toil Goldstein is a longtime fixture of the Israeli military intelligence apparatus, which, for people familiar with that apparatus, includes Unit 8200, which is Israel's signal intelligence agency, which has been widely involved in illegal surveillance, not just of Palestinians in Palestine, but also of Palestinians around the world and numerous other people that are perceived as being hostile or threatening to the state of Israel, which, if you're familiar with how Israel views such people, they tend to use a rather broad brush in those scenarios. And as my work has noted in some of my recent work, they tend to embed themselves also in the national security apparatuses through their tech prowess in companies, and governments throughout the world. So what's relevant about Toil Goldstein, among other things, is that Israel National Cyber Directorate was created by Toil Goldstein, and he was essentially the lead cybersecurity strategy guy at that time for Benjamin Netanyahu. And as part of forming the strategies of the time, one of the initiatives in which Toil Goldstein was involved was admitted openly by Israeli media in 2019. And the way it was described by Israeli media, this particular policy that Goldstein developed, was that programs previously completed or run in-house by Israeli intelligence outfits such as Mossad and Unit 8200 would instead now be run by private tech companies with ties to Israel's military intelligence apparatus. For people familiar, there is a huge, just completely massive intersection between veterans, alumni of Unit 8200 and Israeli military intelligence and Israel's very enormous and globally influential tech sector. So essentially, what you have is the architect of a policy that turns the lion's share of Israel's private tech industry as a front for Israeli intelligence is now the person that's running the most influential public-private partnership at the World Economic Forum for cybersecurity, with a bunch of private companies and some intelligence agencies. For example, the FBI, the UK, and Israeli intelligence are directly affiliated with the Partnership Against Cybercrime. So what does the Partnership Against Cybercrime aim to do? Well, several things, but one of their policies that they promote is completely astounding in the worst sense possible, because essentially they argue that there's only a few key ways to stop cybercrime per this group, this public-private partnership. One of those is to eliminate online anonymity completely, which would lead to the complete surveillance of the internet activity of any and everyone. The second is a merging of Wall Street regulators and intelligence agencies, and they say this is a way to prevent cybercrime in the financial sector. But obviously it's of great benefit to Wall Street and intelligence agencies. For example, in the US, if you go back far enough to the creation of the US national security state and entities like the CIA and its precursor, the Office of Strategic Services, what you will find is that Wall Street is ever present there, and a lot of early, influential figures in the early national security state of the U.S. were Wall Street lawyers or otherwise deeply affiliated with Wall Street. And so you can make a very convincing case that the intelligence agencies of the U.S. and Wall Street have been linked since the intelligence apparatus's inception in the United States. And then it would go further by merging that power nexus with banking regulators. It's a recipe for disaster for people that think there should be a legitimate oversight of intelligence agencies and Wall Street. So these are the types of policies that are housed within the World Economic Forum, and unfortunately not enough attention is paid to them. So there's a lot that's been said, for example, that's inaccurate about the World Economic Forum, particularly over the past 3 years, as they've sort of become rather infamous in some circles. But there is a very reasonable argument as to why this group is nefarious, and unfortunately it doesn't get enough coverage in a lot of independent media. So what are the implications of these policies that are being promoted by the World Economic Forum as it relates to mass surveillance? Well, we've seen mass surveillance being used in the US and also Israel and other countries as an effort to monitor dissent, and of course that relates to an effort to stamp out dissent in many such cases. And a lot of this is being done jointly by the Israeli tech sector and Silicon Valley based in the United States. And as I mentioned earlier, the Israeli tech sector has essentially, for many years, been fused with Israel's national security state. And you can make the exact same argument about Silicon Valley and the U.S. national security state. Indeed, most big tech companies today, the most prominent actors in Silicon Valley, double as major contractors, either for the military or intelligence agencies, and in several cases, both. And so a lot of the data that is being sucked up by those companies is invariably passed off to our national security agencies. And there's a lot of collaboration, not just now, but historically, between the US and Israel and also the UK for that specific purpose. And ultimately, what we see is an effort to profile people, to decide who is a potential threat to the state and who is not, to monitor what is being said online, among other things. There's an effort both in the US and the UK to sort of introduce what has been euphemistically called predictive policing, which is essentially pre-crime. And the idea is that artificial intelligence algorithms, of course owned by specific companies, will enter into a contractual relationship with the national security states. And then that AI algorithm will use a lot of the data sucked up from your internet activity by big tech and related companies to profile you and decide if you may commit some sort of crime in the future. This was pitched by people like Jared Kushner during the Trump administration as something called HARPA, a health DARPA equivalent. And that agency was actually created under the Biden administration, not the Trump administration. But they instead called it ARPA-H as opposed to HARPA to try and distance the two initiatives from each other. But they have the same architects, and it's essentially the same program. And one of the flagship programs of the HARPA model it's an acronym, Safe Homes. I can't remember exactly the full name of the acronym right now. But the goal of that program was to monitor American social media activity for what they referred to as early signs of neuropsychiatric violence, to stop violent acts before they can happen. It's essentially predictive policing, which was used by companies, for example, like Palantir, which are very much tied to the CIA and have had an outsized role in both the US and UK in recent years as it relates to data mining. For example, the NHS has a massive partnership with Palantir, as does the US's HHS. And in the United States, Palantir is a contractor to, I believe, all 18 US intelligence agencies. And Palantir, in addition to their predictive policing, which was piloted, I believe, in New Orleans, and was rather racially biased and became under heavy criticism for that, is one of the main organs of the U.S. national security state in profiling who is a perceived dissident and who is not. So essentially, this ultimately rolls into a much broader war on dissent, which is being incubated by the national security states of the US, the UK, and Israel, and I would assume other countries as well. But when you're looking at the connections of that particular agenda to the World Economic Forum and some of these other entities, that it's very clear that there's an effort to exert domestic control by those specific countries in unison with this type of technology. So this idea of taking surveillance, instead of just having it be external surveillance, as his surveillance has been up to this point, into the body, is something that's been heavily promoted by the World Economic Forum and discussed. And this was also seen in their most recent annual meeting earlier this year, where there was, for example, a panel that talked about the future of brain transparency and how by using wireless earbuds and other technology that is worn on the body already widely in use, different entities, of course, intelligence agencies, big tech, and other affiliated groups have access to data that can be used to read and interpret your brain state and what are the implications of this. And at that particular meeting, they argue that such advances in technology can be used for many purposes, including fighting crime. So when you factor in this particular predictive policing aspect in the fusion between big tech and national security agencies, I mean, this is just a total recipe for disaster. And if we invite surveillance onto and into our bodies, we are crossing a red line into a tech-fueled dystopia. As they've essentially admitted at World Economic Forum meetings, would result in a digital dictatorship that, once implemented, will be almost impossible to escape from. So it's really incumbent on us to educate ourselves about these initiatives, how these types of policies are advancing in our particular countries and regions and localities, and explore different ways about how to stop them. But of course, the most obvious way to stop it would to not be comply or utilize these technologies that can be used to surveil on you in these ways. You know, a lot of this technology is marketed as convenient, right? And some of it may be convenient, but there's different things you can do, maybe walking back some of, your use of some of these more advanced technologies to things that work just as well, but, don't try and surveil your brain state and things like that, because the more of us that don't comply, the less successful this agenda will be. So I recently released a 2-volume book called One Nation Under Blackmail, which is essentially about how organized crime and intelligence agencies in the United States during World War II fused, and how a lot of these same organized crime networks were very much an integral part of the formation of the national security apparatus of the State of Israel, and how, as a consequence of that, the national security states of both countries have collaborated extensively on illegal activity and have been involved jointly in various scandals throughout the years, and are working to fuse. And ultimately, I trace the evolution of this particular group to actors that are rather notorious, such as Jeffrey Epstein, but also the effort to create this model that I've talked about today, this effort to extensively surveil the public, profile people, and eliminate dissidents. This exact same network has been very interested in doing that for a very long time, arguably going as far back as the Vietnam War. But of course, we saw this in a very significant way during past scandals, such as the Iran-Contra affair, which came to light in the 1980s. And all of this I attempt, to explore in my book in great detail. But I'm charting a lot of time. Essentially, it's almost 100-year history. But what I'm trying to do is delve a lot into the intelligence links of Jeffrey Epstein, trying to help people make sense of them and the Maxwell family and their activities. And one of my findings is that the Maxwells, as well as Epstein, were very much involved with the Israeli tech sector, as well as the Silicon Valley in the United States, and a lot of the most prominent heads of Silicon Valley. And ultimately what this means for a lot of the things that we've talked about earlier today, you essentially have Jeffrey Epstein, right, who was involved in sexual blackmail to a significant degree, being involved in that, and also the rise of big tech to a significant extent, which has been surveilling us, and a lot of that electronic surveillance can easily be used as blackmail, making the sex blackmail practiced by Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell essentially irrelevant in today's world. And I discuss some of the implications of that and how companies like Palantir, for example, fit in with the Maxwell family. Some pretty surprising ties to be discovered there. Among other things, of course. For anyone interested in these types of topics, I definitely recommend taking a look. So there's an in-print version. It's a 2-volume book. There's an ebook version, of course, and also forthcoming an audiobook version of both books.